Please welcome my guest, Victoria Reynolds.
It's just about consciously choosing to not lose yourself in motherhood. And it's very difficult not to, because that's how we're built biologically. In this belief where a woman has to spat out one after another, there's never an opportunity for her to ever think clearly about herself. I mean, you can't. It's pretty much impossible.
When I was a child, I married. And I had 6 children to be responsible for before I was ever allowed to be responsible for myself or knew how.
So how old were you when you got married again?
Allegedly 15, but my birth certificate's a forgery. I grew 2.5 inches after the birth of my first child, and looking back on all the intimate circumstances, I seriously doubt that I was 15. But the children were 15 and got their birth certificates later, about the time they married, because at that time the assumption was that if a child was married at the age of 15 with their parents' consent, even into polygamy, it took it out of the child molest laws. And I personally know 2 women that were married at 9 and 11, but it was a secret. They were allegedly not touched sexually until they became of age.
Right, which at the time I understand was 14.
Yes.
Yeah. So and that was the case in a lot of states across America. The legal marrying age until fairly recently was 14 with parental consent. And it's only been the last few years where people have tried to say, oh, that's a little young.
Well, our choices were defined for us. We could marry Uncle so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so, but we didn't have the right to marry outside the cult.
Yeah.
We'd be destroyed.
Okay, so I have to clarify Uncle so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so. I mean, it really is kind of Uncle so-and-so. There's so much inbreeding there that it's a
Yes, there is.
strong chance that Uncle so-and-so really is your uncle. When I was really small, growing up on the ranch, we called everybody aunt and uncle. I was told it was because if we were ever raided by the government, they would never be able to pinpoint what kids and what women belonged to which man. There would be no attachments to who belonged to whom. So everybody was aunt and uncle.
Right.
So in my particular case, because my parents were converts, none of those people were actually my aunts or uncles. Although, when my sister married Uncle D, it was bizarre to even think of that in the real world that you would marry your uncle. He technically wasn't my uncle. We just called him Uncle D.
My mom was given, before she died, as a plural wife to my uncle, who was already married to her sister.
Right, and that's what I was saying. In my particular case, it wasn't really uncle. However, not that unusual for people to marry their uncles.
Yeah, my
their
dad
relatives.
married my mother's sister, so my dad was my uncle because he was married to my aunt. They replace wives. They rearrange situations and assign a wife to somebody else or take them away or whatever if they don't like what a guy's doing. And Dad was independent. He wasn't going along with the AUB. Anyway, long story. At the end of my mother's life, she married Lyman Jessup, who served time in the Utah State Penitentiary with my father in 1945, as did my father-in-law. That my fate was sealed.
Right.
But anyway, Lyman Jessup was married to Mom's sister. So my mom married my uncle already. He was already my uncle. Then my dad was married to my mother's sister. So my aunt's husband would become my uncle. So my dad was my uncle. It was Uncle Daddy. That's true.
Well, I know. I laugh because the whole polygonometry, as you call it, I would love to get my hands on a family tree, because it is so screwed up and so twisted that I don't think the average person can even wrap their head around the idea that a girl can be her own grandmother. I mean, and it happens.
Well, the reality is that I am related, literally blood related, to a lot of people. Have you heard of the disease called fumarus?
I have.
Tell our listening audience what that is and where it is the most prevalent ever.
It's a fascinating genetic disorder that is pretty much only confined to these polygamist communities. and occurs specifically when certain families, when certain last names intermarry with certain other last names. But there's so much intermarrying going on. There really are only a dozen different names. It's fascinating. It's like, oh, okay, there's another. Okay, yeah. Crazy.
But they're all intermarried.
And they're all intermarried. And this continual crossbreeding is creating some real sick children.
Physically, mentally, emotionally.
And some of those children die when they're babies because they're so genetically messed up.
And isn't there a graveyard with babies' bodies in it? Flora tried to tell them about that, and nobody would investigate that because these babies' births were never recorded.
Oh, yeah, I have pictures of it. Yeah, I filmed it personally in Colorado City, the baby cemetery.
Don't we have a friend who grew up in Kearns, right next to Salt Lake City, whose mom had a baby and they just buried it in the backyard and did never record it?
Yes.
Yes, we do. And this was extremely common.
Well, and a lot of those births, very, very, very few of these women have children in the hospital or under any kind of professional medical care. So if they have a baby and the baby's a stillborn, it's nothing. It's as if that baby never existed.
Well, if they have a baby and the child is not whole in any way, they blame the mother. She wasn't righteous enough. Never mind that her bloodlines crossed and recrossed before she ever had babies.
Right.
It's all her fault.
Yeah.
And she's a lesser human being because of it.
Right, because a woman's worth is in her womb.
Right. So she produces a child that's less than perfect, and it's her fault.
Mm-hmm. That's the misperception. And, you know, as I was saying off camera, misperception causes blindness.
Misperception causes blindness. That's a great statement because it does.
Mm-hmm.
And we were blind. We grew up blind and in fear of a bloodthirsty and terrifying God that said we had to live polygamy or we would never go to the highest degree of glory because only polygamists went. And with all the interbreeding, with all the malformed children, with all the lack of worldly evil education, with all of the privileges of knowledge withheld from us, we were God's chosen people, the only ones he loved, and the chosen and best people on earth, and the rest of the world was evil and wicked. Is that not true?
Yes, and so here's one of those dichotomies, again, like the free will choice thing, another dichotomy that really frustrated me, tried to understand, was that it was not okay for us to be proud of ourselves. It was not okay for us to even look in the mirror and think we might be pretty. It was not okay to think highly of ourselves at all, and yet the level of arrogance toward people outside of our community was astounding.
Yes,
it's one of those, it's not okay to be prideful, but it is okay to be full of pride and arrogant if we're talking about
Gentiles. The non-believer is lower than us. Isn't it amazing that the sacrifices you can get people to make if you throw them a title like God's chosen people? You are suffering because God loves you most.
Right.
That's what we were told.
That's what we're taught. That God loves us. That suffering sharpens the sword. Suffering makes us better people. And in the same token, suffering comes from the devil. What? Like, that makes no sense to me. For suffering because we were tempted by the devil, but suffering makes us better, and God loves the people who suffer the most. Like, another one of those just very confusing beliefs. It's like, is it one or the other? Pick one.
Well, my husband told me that I was immoral because I didn't think he should have all these wives. So I was immoral, and if I didn't change my attitude, I would end up in hell. Or worse.
Destroyed.
Yes.
A woman who didn't lovingly embrace other wives, her soul would be destroyed.
And yet, look how many women whose soul we saw destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
They aged out. They worked themselves to death. They died young. Depression, suicide, early death.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional illnesses, physical illnesses are very prevalent in polygamist women.
Right. So what they were experiencing was hell. It's not out there after you die. It's right smack here in physical reality, and they were in hell.
You made the statement, if you choose to do nothing, it's still a choice.
Mm-hmm.
This is something polygamous women don't really understand.
I don't think most people understand that.
They
I really
stand aside and watch their husbands beat their children unmercifully, or themselves, or take a child bride, or
molest their
or
children.
molest their children, which is
Very
child
common.
molest is very common in
Yeah.
polygamy because there's no outside interference. It's a closed organization.
Yeah, and the women aren't allowed to say anything. I mean,
No.
and children aren't allowed to say anything. If you say something bad about a man, any man, you're the one that's wrong.
Right, because they have the power of God. They have the priesthood.
Right. They're
you're
God's
left.
servants, and how dare you say anything bad about any man? So, child molestation is just runs horrifically through these communities.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to so many women, and they thought they were the only one molested or raped when they were a child. But
They're
it's
very
really
few. So
high.
I was one time telling someone how I had been raped in high school, and this woman looked at me and said, "Who hasn't?"
Whoa!
I thought, wow, is it really that prevalent? That was the response. Who hasn't? As if that's the norm.
But yet, I was told that if we were not virgins when we got married, we would be lesser human beings. We weren't fit to be married in the temple. Now, of course, they weren't proper LDS members. They
Right.
didn't belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They just
They held that
well,
carrot over you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but they did make all their temple clothes and have their rituals and stuff outside the church.
Yeah, but you know what? But we would have never been allowed in the temple to begin with. That's
Yeah.
what's hysterical to me. Like the Mormon Church would ever allow us in the temple?
Right,
Nowhere near it. But they held that carrot over us.
right. They said you can never be married in the temple. You
Unless-
can never be in the highest degree of glory, and you will be a servant for time and all eternity, or you can have your blood spilled, your throat slit from ear to ear, that your blood can ascend, not drop on the ground. This blood's going to ascend to God like an incense to heaven to save your evil soul.
Right.
Yet, the man who took your virginity was never, ever mentioned. You did it all by yourself. You're an evil, wicked person.
So as a girl and you lose your virginity,
Right.
you lose all honor and all respect.
Right.
And you will never be loved in the eyes of any man or God or
Right.
his man-made God. And that's not just in our little cult. I mean, there are other cultures that whole honor thing, if a woman loses her virginity, she is worthless.
It's especially common, though, in polygamous cultures across
Very
the
much
world.
so. And it really, underlying all of that is it really would be okay to kill a woman to save her soul.
Right.
And
Because
I think they don't go, it's illegal, but underlying all of that, there is that belief.
But God's laws are higher than the laws of man, so it's okay to kill her. You don't have to, but God sanctions it. And this is
Right.
how we were taught.
And if you really loved your daughter, you would do that.
Yeah. And people say, well, they can say that, but nobody ever got killed. That is not true, is it?
No. It's not something there's certainly not a rampage of honor killings, if you will, here in America in these polygamous beliefs. But there were a few that made the news.
Yes, and
Yeah.
there are quite a few that made the news. Ervil LeBaron had approximately 30 people murdered for disobedience, his own brother, and many other people, and he called them all honor killings because they didn't obey. And you can look him up on the web. He's called the Mormon Manson. He never was a Mormon as far as belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but claiming and blaming Mormonism.
Yeah.
Blaming someone, a church, blaming a church they don't belong to.
Blaming a church they don't even belong to, which is,
Right.
I mean, for me, there's one part of me that really feels for the Mormon church. It's like, oh, would you please leave us out of it? I mean, it has nothing to do with the Mormon church.
But they blame, along with the Mormon church, they blame history of the Mormon church for what they personally are doing today.
Right.
They blame history and a church they don't belong to, but they do it because it works.
Yes.
They have sanctuary in Utah because there was polygamy in early Mormonism. And I don't think that the Mormon people know how to deal with it. I don't think they know how to deal with it, so they don't. So Utah is a sanctuary for people that want to set themselves up as a prophet, and you can spell that any way you want to because it's very profitable.
Yes.
And create human slavery in the name of freedom of religion.
Right. And as I've often said, that is the real meaning of taking God's name in vain.
Yes, it is.
Using God's name for your own vain purposes, and people do it all the time. And the way we were raised, is a prime example of what that looks like.
The bondage is worse than the child that didn't have that kind of spiritual coercion. If a child is sold as a child bride or in trafficking or sex trafficking without religion, she knows that she's a slave. And she knows she's being mistreated, but it isn't compounded by threatening her soul to like it or not, or she will be damned forever.
Right. So the as you know, my area of focus is teaching self-worth, and what happens is that a soul's worth is actually tied to that. It is very, very hard to break out of those beliefs when your soul's worth is attached to that. It's one thing to be emotionally abused and work through emotional abuse, and there are therapists out there that know how to work through that. When you've been spiritually abused, when your soul has been traumatized, it is really, really hard to break out of those beliefs because they're so ingrained in you. Even the idea of leaving that environment is terrifying, because if they choose to leave, then their soul is damned for eternity. It's a trap that's really hard to break out of, and terrifying at the thought of even leaving it.
There's another compound fracture. We were taught from the beginning that the children all belong to the priesthood. The children belong to the men. The women belonged to the men. They were property, so the children belonged to the men.
Right.
So if a woman left, she could not have her children.
Right, and so when a woman does choose to leave, it literally is escaping with her children. You have to fight to keep your children, because, see, ultimately, at the core of the belief is that the children belong to the men, and men are representatives of God, and that those children are actually God's children.
Right.
So because they are God's children through the kingdoms of men,
Right.
the children belong to the men, not
Right.
the women. The women are just the womb in which the baby grew. The women, literally, that's what the term woman actually means, is womb of men. And the woman is just the womb that grew the man's child. At the core of that, that's a belief that's thousands of years old, that we're finally starting to say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy into that anymore. But that's really where that belief stems from, is that the woman is nothing more than the womb for man's children.
Even in the Kingston group, one of the Kingstons had committed crimes. He was abusive. He was a criminal. He was found guilty. And one of his plural wives escaped with 3 little children. And she lived in a car for a few days until she went to live with a friend that helped her out. And when she went to court, she left to protect her children from him because he was abusive. When she went to court, the court took those children away from her and gave them to him because he had the money, even though he had the criminal record. And this is happening over and over. And this fact terrorizes polygamous women to leave, because the polygamist men have the money and they have no recourse, no place to go, no education, all these children, not a way to provide for them. So in that panic and desperation to save their children, they don't leave and they have more children.
Well, and not only that, it's not just that the children belong to the men, it's that the children belong to the religion as a whole.
Right.
And we see that really with the FLDS, where the men get kicked out for being supposedly unworthy, and their wives get reassigned to another man. And if the wife does have the courage to leave, or if the man gets kicked out, the children have to stay, because the children are property of the religion itself.
That's right.
Because they're God's children, not men's or women's children.
Right.
And so those children become enslaved to the religion. Now, it's fascinating is that those kids have no idea. Some of those kids in the FLDS have no idea who their parents actually are. They've been moved around so much within the religion.
When you talk about children becoming property of the religion, let's talk about the economical property of the religion. And
who's profiting from it,
and
how the prophet is profiting from it.
Yes,
yeah.
And the foundational belief of this particular organized money scheme is extremely prevalent in polygamous cults. As a matter of fact, I don't know one where it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But define to our listening audience the money trail.
You know what? It's interesting because one of the beliefs that I was raised with was this concept called United Order.
Right.
And so my dad, my parents were one of the few people that joined for religious purposes. I mean, I know now looking at all these people I grew up with, very few of them became converts because they believed it was what God wanted. An awful lot of them, or at least the men who became members because they were big, egotistical, I'm going to go get me more wives. And only a man with a humongous ego is even attracted to that lifestyle.
Right.
Who already has this need for control, because it's just such a prime environment to just control so many people, and this ego of building your own kingdom and having as many wives and as much sex as you could possibly want. It's totally ego driven. And so then you have men like my dad who joined the religion because he was reading, some of the Mormon text from way back at the beginning of the Mormon Church, and he was convinced after reading this that if he wanted to get to the highest level of heaven, he had to. This was a commandment by God that he needed to live polygamy. Right. And my mom too. My mom said, then she was never a religious person until she met my dad, and so she believed it too when he said, this is what God is really commanding us to do, and we need to do this if we really want to make it to the top of the pyramid. And so my parents converted to that way of life because they thought that's what God wanted them to do. And he would look around at some of the men in my community and just be dumbfounded. He remember him saying once, I think it was in high school, that the men in this community act like dogs after a female in heat.
Right.
Like as soon as a new woman would become available, as soon as a young girl was old enough to start looking at, they would just leech onto her and start fighting over who has the rights to her. I mean, how many men do you know said, I got a revelation, this girl belongs to me? It's literally like a, woo, fresh meat. And they, anyway, I got off course, but with this belief, this United Order belief, was that you turn 100% of everything you own over to the order. And that's what my dad did, and that's what a lot of people do. In order to stay in God's greatest graces, you own nothing. You give everything you own and everything you are, you dedicate and consecrate to the religion. My dad gave his entire paycheck. Every paycheck he got, he gave to the religion.
Well, they misquoted the Bible the way they wanted to, and they said to give up all your worldly goods and follow me.
Yeah, that we have these amazing minds that have the ability to interpret things.
And to see it through any color of glasses
and to
that's
see
in our
it,
head.
Well, and we all have our own unique perspective, which is why, you can have two exact same circumstances and have two completely different perspectives, because every one of us is unique and every one of us has our own unique perception. The difference is that when you have your perception and you force other people to believe what your perception is, that's what happened here.